You're a 7-year-old boy playing in your Christian village in the Balkans. When Ottoman officials arrive at your door, they're not here for taxes or tribute. They're here for you. You'll never see your family again. The Ottoman Empire lasted over 6 centuries, stretching across 3 continents and controlling the fate of millions. We remember it for magnificent architecture, powerful sultans, and strategic brilliance. But behind the golden facades of palaces and the glory of conquest lay sexual practices so disturbing that even contemporary observers struggled to document them. These weren't isolated incidents or cultural misunderstandings. They were systematic policies that turned human sexuality into a weapon of control, exploitation, and terror. What you're about to discover comes from Ottoman administrative records, eyewitness accounts from diplomats and travelers, and archaeological evidence that reveals how an empire weaponized the most intimate aspects of human experience. The practices we'll explore weren't aberrations. They were institutional policies that shaped the lives of millions across centuries. The most chilling aspect isn't just what happened, but how methodically it was organized. The Ottomans kept meticulous records of everything, including the systematic exploitation of children, the operation of forced castration centers, and the management of sexual slavery on an industrial scale. These documents still exist today, filed away in archives waiting for historians brave enough to examine them. But before we continue, if you enjoy dark and forgotten history, consider subscribing and comment where you're watching from. It helps us a lot to make more videos like this.
Ow!
Back to the video. Let's begin with perhaps the most psychologically devastating practice of all, the devshirme system, also known as the child levy or blood tax.
Ow.
Every few years, Ottoman officials would sweep through Christian villages in the Balkans, conducting what they called collecting. Well, but they weren't collecting taxes or goods. They were collecting children. The process was terrifyingly efficient. Officials arrived in a village with detailed records showing exactly how many Christian families lived there, how many boys of the right age were available, and when that village had last contributed to the levy. They kept spreadsheets of human misery, tracking children like livestock across their empire. Boys between the ages of 7 and 20 were prime targets, though the preferred range was much younger. Some records show children as young as 4 being taken, torn from their mother's arms by officials who viewed their tears as simply the cost of imperial administration. The selection process was methodical and cruel. Officials examined each boy as if they were purchasing horses, checking their health, intelligence, and physical development. But here's what makes this practice particularly horrifying. These children weren't being taken to die in mines or fields. They were being taken to serve the empire in the most intimate ways possible. The brightest and most attractive boys would be sent to the palace, where they would be converted to Islam, given new names, and trained to serve the Sultan's personal needs. The process wasn't just about acquiring servants. It was about complete psychological reconstruction. The children were immediately separated from anyone who spoke their language. They were forbidden to use their birth names or speak of their families. Any sign of attachment to their previous life was beaten out of them. Within months, most couldn't even remember their original names. They became blank slates upon which the empire could write whatever identity served its purposes. Many of these boys were destined for the Janissary Corps, the empire's elite military unit. But even this seemingly honorable fate came with a dark twist. The Janissaries were expected to remain celibate and completely devoted to the Sultan. Their only intimate relationships were with each other, creating a military culture where homosexual relationships weren't just tolerated but became institutionalized. The empire even created a specific military unit called the Chival Battalion to manage these relationships. This wasn't some informal arrangement. It was an official military formation with its own command structure, regulations, and purpose. The battalion existed specifically to channel and control the homoerotic relationships within the Janissary Corps, ensuring that sexual tensions didn't disrupt military discipline. Historical records describe how this battalion operated with disturbing detail. Members held privileged positions and had access to resources that other soldiers didn't. They were essentially professional partners for higher-ranking officers, their military service inseparable from their sexual availability. But the devshirme system had an even darker purpose. The most attractive boys, those deemed too beautiful for military service, were set aside for a different fate entirely. These children were destined for the palace's private quarters, where they would serve the Sultan and his courtiers in ways that defy modern comprehension. Some of these boys were castrated to become eunuchs. The process was brutal and often fatal. Most castrations were performed in Egypt or Ethiopia, where Islamic laws prohibiting the practice could be circumvented by having Christians or Jews perform the operations. The mortality rate was staggering. Historical accounts suggest that only 10% of boys subjected to castration survived the procedure. Think about that for a moment. The empire was so committed to acquiring eunuchs that they were willing to kill 9 out of every 10 boys to get 1 survivor. The mathematics of this system are chilling. If they needed 100 eunuchs, they were prepared to mutilate 1,000 children, watching 900 die in the process. The survivors faced a fate that many considered worse than death. African boys typically had their entire genitalia removed, becoming what the Ottomans called black eunuchs. These eunuchs were considered more trustworthy around the sultan's women and often rose to positions of significant power within the palace hierarchy. European boys from the Balkans usually had only their testicles removed, becoming white eunuchs who served primarily in administrative roles. The psychological impact on these children cannot be overstated. They were not only physically mutilated, but completely severed from any possibility of normal human relationships. But castration wasn't the only fate awaiting beautiful boys in the Ottoman system. Some were designated as Kchek dancers, young male performers, who dressed as women and entertained at parties and celebrations. These boys occupied a disturbing space between genders, neither fully male nor female, in the eyes of Ottoman society. The audiences at these performances were notorious for their violent behavior. Historical accounts describe men becoming so aroused by the young dancers that they would fight each other for the opportunity to sexually assault them. Glasses were broken, voices were lost from shouting, and people were sometimes killed in the chaos that surrounded these performances. The dancers themselves had no protection from this violence. They were expected to submit to whatever advances came their way, their bodies treated as entertainment for crowds of drunk and aggressive men. The practice became so associated with sexual violence that it was eventually suppressed, but only after generations of boys had been subjected to this systematic abuse. Perhaps most disturbing of all was a practice known as the Tavsolan system. The term translates roughly to bunny boys, a euphemism that barely conceals the horrific reality it describes. These were young Christian boys, typically Greek or from other European regions, who were brought to the palace specifically for the sexual gratification of high-ranking officials. Unlike other forms of palace service, the Tavsolan system operated in complete secrecy. These boys had no official status, no protection under law, and no hope of advancement or eventual freedom. They existed solely as sexual objects for the entertainment of their masters, hidden away from public view and historical record. The system was deliberately kept small and secretive, but its existence reveals something crucial about Ottoman sexual practices. This wasn't about cultural differences or different moral standards. This was about the systematic sexual exploitation of children organized and maintained by the highest levels of government. The boys taken into this system faced a reality that defied every natural bond known to humanity. Parents would receive no word of their children's fate. No letters, no visits, nothing but the endless silence of loss. Some families would wait decades for sons who would never return, holding on to hope that somewhere in the vast Ottoman territories their children still remembered home. The empire's records show the calculated cruelty of this separation. Officials deliberately moved children as far as possible from their birth regions, ensuring that even if a boy managed to escape, he would have no way of finding his way back to his village. The linguistic barriers were insurmountable. A boy taken from a Serbian village might find himself in Constantinople, surrounded by Turkish, Arabic, and Persian speakers. His native language becoming a useless relic of a past he was forbidden to acknowledge. The conversion process was designed to erase not just religious identity, but cultural memory itself. Boys were given new names that bore no resemblance to their birth names. They were taught that their previous lives had been lives of ignorance and sin, that their families were infidels deserving of conquest, who were forced to participate in rituals that mocked their former faith. The most psychologically devastating aspect was how the system turned victims into perpetrators. Boys who survived the initial trauma and adapted to palace life often became the ones selecting the next generation of victims. They would return to the Balkans as adults, pointing out the most attractive children in villages like the ones they had once called home. The empire had perfected a cycle of trauma that ensured its own continuation. Moving beyond the child levy system reveals another layer of Ottoman sexual exploitation that operated on an even larger scale. The empire's approach to female sexuality created a marketplace of human flesh that dwarfed anything seen in the contemporary world. This wasn't simply about concubinage or marriage customs. This was about the systematic commodification of women's bodies on an industrial scale. The slave markets of Constantinople operated with the efficiency of modern corporations. Women were categorized, priced, and sold according to a complex hierarchy that reduced human beings to mere merchandise. African women commanded different prices than European women. Virgins were worth more than non-virgins. Young girls brought higher prices than mature women. The empire maintained detailed pricing structures for human sexuality. A typical African girl might sell for 1,500 to 2,500 kurush if intended for household work. But if she was destined for sexual use, the price could double or triple. European women, particularly those from Greece or the Balkans, commanded even higher prices, with some selling for amounts equivalent to small fortunes. The most expensive category was reserved for what the Ottomans called odalisks, women specifically trained for sexual service in imperial harems. These women could sell for tens of thousands of kurush, their value determined by beauty, training, and perceived fertility. The empire maintained training facilities where captured women were taught the arts of seduction, massage, and sexual performance, transforming traumatized captives into polished commodities. But the numbers only tell part of the story. Behind each transaction was a human being torn from her family, stripped of her identity, and reduced to a sexual object for the pleasure of her purchaser. The treatment of these women within the harems reveals another dimension of Ottoman sexual cruelty. The popular image of harems as luxurious spaces filled with pampered concubines bears no resemblance to historical reality. Most harem women lived in conditions of constant fear, competing desperately for the attention that might elevate them from mere slaves to favored concubines. The competition was deliberately fostered by the system's design. Women were pitted against each other in elaborate displays designed to entertain their masters. They were forced to perform increasingly degrading acts to distinguish themselves from their rivals. The empire's records show that infanticide was commonplace, particularly for children born to African mothers. The mixed-race children of these unions were often killed immediately after birth, their existence seen as inconvenient complications in the machinery of sexual exploitation. Contemporary observers noted the absence of mixed-race children in Constantinople. Despite the obvious presence of thousands of African women living in sexual relationships with Turkish men, the conclusion was inescapable. These children were being systematically eliminated to maintain the racial hierarchies that the empire considered essential to its social order. Women who survived long enough to age out of sexual desirability faced fates that were often worse than death. They might be sold to brothels, abandoned on the streets, or simply killed to make room for younger replacements. The empire had no pension system for used-up concubines, no retirement plan for women who had spent their youth serving imperial pleasure. The legal framework supporting this system reveals how deeply embedded sexual exploitation was in Ottoman governance. Laws explicitly stated that raping a free woman carried the death penalty, while raping a slave woman resulted in a fine equivalent to damaging someone's property. The empire had created a two-tiered system of human worth that made systematic sexual violence not just legal, but economically rational. The systematic nature of these practices becomes even more horrifying when we examine how the empire institutionalized sexual violence as entertainment. Public executions weren't just about punishment. They were about creating spectacles where sexual humiliation served as the main attraction. Criminals convicted of sexual offenses faced punishments designed to mirror their crimes in the most degrading ways possible. The audience didn't just watch passively, they participated, shouting suggestions, placing bets on how long victims would survive, treating human suffering as sport. The empire's approach to justice revealed a society that had completely normalized sexual violence. Rape wasn't just a crime to be punished. It was a tool of statecraft, a method of demonstrating power, a form of entertainment for the masses. The legal codes didn't just permit this violence, they regulated it, creating detailed procedures for how sexual torture should be conducted to maximize both suffering and spectacle. Archaeological evidence from execution sites supports these horrific accounts. Excavations have uncovered remains showing systematic mutilation that goes far beyond simple killing. Bodies were violated in ways that suggest prolonged torture, designed specifically to destroy victims' sexual identity before ending their lives. The empire had perfected the art of using sexuality as a weapon of ultimate degradation. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Ottoman sexual practices was how they created a culture where this exploitation seemed normal. Children grew up in a society where human trafficking was visible on every street corner. Young people learned that bodies could be bought and sold like any other commodity. Entire generations were raised to see sexual violence not as aberrant behavior, but as the natural order of things. The empire's educational system reinforced these attitudes through religious instruction that portrayed sexual slavery as divinely sanctioned. Families lived in constant terror that their children might be taken. Parents would mutilate their own sons and daughters, scarring faces or breaking limbs to make them less desirable to Ottoman collectors. The empire had created a society where loving parents felt compelled to harm their children to protect them from worse fates. The economic incentives underlying these practices reveal how deeply sexual exploitation was embedded in the empire's foundation. The slave trade wasn't a side business. It was a pillar of imperial finance, generating revenues that funded military expansion, palace construction, and administrative operations. The empire's budget depended on the systematic destruction of human dignity across 3 continents. Trade routes were established specifically to facilitate human trafficking. Diplomatic agreements included clauses governing the exchange of slaves. The documentation of these practices exists in disturbing detail. Because the Ottomans were meticulous record keepers, they maintained ledgers tracking the ages, origins, and prices of enslaved people. They kept inventories of palace harems, listing women like furniture or livestock. They preserved correspondence between officials discussing the sexual preferences of their superiors, and façade by them for strategic procurement. These records survive today in archives across Turkey, providing undeniable evidence of systematic sexual exploitation that operated for centuries. The Ottoman Empire's sexual practices represent one of history's most systematic examples of how power can corrupt every aspect of human experience. These weren't isolated incidents or cultural misunderstandings. They were deliberate policies designed to reduce human beings to objects for the gratification of those in power. The empire created a civilization built on the systematic destruction of human dignity, leaving scars that persist to this day. Understanding this dark chapter of history isn't just about condemning past actions. It's about recognizing how power structures can exploit human sexuality and turn intimate relationships into weapons of control. The records are there, waiting in archives for historians brave enough to examine them. The archaeological evidence continues to emerge, reminding us that history doesn't simply disappear because it makes us uncomfortable. As we reflect on the Ottoman Empire's legacy, we are confronted with uncomfortable questions about exploitation and our responsibility to ensure such atrocities never happen again. Let us remember the millions of victims whose suffering has been largely forgotten and work to restore their humanity through historical truth. Thank you for joining us on this journey through a chilling part of history. If you found this exploration important, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Together, we can honor the past and strive for a more just future.